everyone, to the afternoon session, session 2 of our 5th annual symposium, Advancing Education in Muslim Societies, Implications for Policy, Pedagogy, and Development. We had an excellent session number 1, which is going to be followed by an excellent session number 2. And we have 4 presentations that will be composing the session 2. And of course, the video streams will run, and then we will come back and have question and answer after the videos have streamed. Everyone, please feel free to put your questions into the chat as you hear our presenters, and presenters can be looking at those after they get done with their particular presentation stream. And I will help with Q&A facilitation after the videos. Also, thank you to all of our audience participants for joining us and taking time from your schedule to be with us this afternoon. And just a reminder that there is an evaluation form, and Saulat is providing that to us. So I am Patty Kubo. I'm professor and co-conference organizer here from Indiana University School of Education, Bloomington. And our team is composed of my Ilham Nasser, Dr. Ilham Nasser from IIIT, who also is the co-sponsor with me of this symposium. And we have had 2 other leaders of our team, Saulat Pervez, who is an associate researcher at IIIT, as well as Daria Dogan, who is a PhD candidate in our Ed Policy Studies program, and also with a joint major, second major or degree at the doctoral level of Middle East languages and cultures. So we're the 4-member team, just introducing ourselves to you. You've seen us on emails and things, but I don't want to belabor it. I want to be able to go right into now our presentations, okay?
Welcome to the session on colorism in the Muslim world, implications for anti-bias, anti-racist education in the Muslim Ummah. I'm Hakeem Rashid. I'm a professor of human development at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I want to start out this session with a quote from the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Quote, "Throngs of people, obviously Muslims from everywhere, bound on the pilgrimage, were hugging and embracing. They were of all complexions. The whole atmosphere was of warmth and friendliness. The feeling hit me that there really wasn't any color problem here. The effect was as though I had stepped out of prison." El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, was obviously idealistic in his perspective on race and color consciousness in the Muslim world. He was coming out of one of the most racist situations in the world, the United States of America. He didn't know that colorism had existed in the Muslim world for hundreds of years. It's important that that colorism be recognized and dealt with if we're going to have the kind of Muslim Ummah that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wanted for us. It's important to keep in mind that the Muslim world has been colonized for much of the past 5 centuries or so. Frantz Fanon has talked about colonization, its impact on the mentality of people, and so has Albert Memmi. Fanon has said, quote, "Every colonized people, in other words, every people whose soul and inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the mother country. The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards." Memmi has said, "It is significant that racism is part of colonialism throughout the world, and it is no coincidence. Racism sums up and symbolizes the fundamental relation which unites colonialists and colonized. This is the reality that the Muslim world has to deal with, that this colonization process has created a color consciousness that has permeated virtually every aspect of life. We see colorism in Pakistan, the discussion of skin whitening creams by Zahra Haider. We see discussions of colorism in Cairo, Egypt. We see discussions of colorism in Nigeria, where 77% of the women in Nigeria use skin lightening products. We see the phenomena of skin bleaching, as described by Sophia Meek in her article, Muslims Trying to Become Whiter. And we can talk about the plague of colorism that has been manifested within, first of all, cultural contexts that predate European racism, and secondly, societies that have within the last 5 centuries been economically, socially, and culturally ravaged by European colonialism and its attendant white supremacist ideology. First of all, it's important, though, to talk about colorism and the Indian subcontinent, because this is a kind of colorism that predates European colonialism. The Indian subcontinent is home to over 500 million Muslims between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. These countries are historically and culturally rooted in the Hindu-based caste system of India, a system characterized by skin color differentiation as a measure of worth. The Hindi word varna, which the Portuguese later turned into the word caste, is translated by some sources as color. Colorism is evident in some of the early Sanskrit texts produced by the Aryan migration into the Indus Valley. This migration into the Indus Valley during what became known as the Vedic period resulted in a consolidation of Aryan power over the indigenous darker-skinned people of the region. The conflation of the Indian caste system with the emerging British racism, a racism rooted in white supremacist ideology, institutionalized a hierarchical color-based society in ways that had been unknown historically. Colorism in the Indian subcontinent was thus established in a manner that was unique in the Muslim world. The racial tolerance promoted within Islamic religious doctrine could not totally supplant the white supremacist doctrine that had come to dominate the Indian worldview. As Pakistan and Bangladesh split from India, Muslim majority countries were created that reflected the colorism that had its origins in Hindu theology. Although the various nation states of the Muslim world gained their nominal political independence during the post-World War II period, the residue of cultural imperialism remained. This white supremacy was a major element of cultural imperialism, and notions of the inferiority of darker-skinned people ravaged the colonized Muslim world as well as the non-Muslim colonized world. Colorism in its current manifestation, that is the elevation of European standards of beauty, and as a psycho-cultural issue in the Muslim world, can largely be traced to European colonization of Muslim lands. The domination of the Indian subcontinent, the subjugation of most of the African continent by Europeans, had both economic and cultural consequences. The economic consequences included the widespread ravishing of Muslim lands in terms of natural resources, while the cultural consequences included the elevation of the beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors of the colonizers above those of the indigenous Muslim populations. Evidence from multiple sources suggests that the original Arabs were dark-skinned people, virtually indistinguishable from the inhabitants of Ethiopia and Sudan. But we've seen colorism emerge in Muslim Arab countries. The lighter complexions of the current inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula is attributed to the relatively recent migration of Turks and other more Caucasoid groups into Arabia. The dominance of Arabia by the Ottoman Empire led to an ongoing influx of lighter complexioned people, not only the Muslim holy sites of Mecca and Medina, but into the Arabian Peninsula as a whole. Over time, these lighter-skinned Arabs supplanted the darker-skinned Arabs as the dominant population group in much the same way that the population base of the United States became predominantly European in the wake of the genocide and the displacement of North America's indigenous peoples. Racism can be seen as a disease that's reflected in the Quran, where Iblis says, I am better than Adam, that Allah created me from fire and him from clay. And Allah says, get out of here, get down from this. It is not for you to be arrogant here. Prophet Muhammad's antidote, as seen in his last sermon, reflected in his last sermon, he tells the Muslim Ummah that all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brotherhood. And this is the challenge, to overcome that disease of racism that ultimately has manifested itself in the colorism that we see today. It is reported that al-Mubarak, one of the leading figures in the Basran grammatical tradition, claimed, quote, the Arabs used to take pride in their brown and black complexion, and they had a distaste for a white and fair complexion. And they used to say that such was the complexion of the non-Arabs. What can we do to begin to eliminate this notion of colorism in the Muslim community? Work related to colorism in the Muslim community can lead to education programming interventions in a variety of contexts. We can talk about the integration of anti-racist materials into weekend Muslim schools, community awareness forums, youth conferences addressing the issue of colorism, specific training for Muslim educators, and also imam training programs. This work must be built on a program of study that involves the study of, first of all, the historical roots of ancient civilizations in Africa and Asia, and secondly, the historical and cultural origins of white supremacy. Muslim social science researchers interested in the eradication of colorism should examine the myriad factors that contribute to the perpetuation of this practice that so clearly violates the tenets of Islam. Potential topics for research might include cultural factors that promote and perpetuate colorist attitudes and behaviors, parenting practices that promote acceptance of skin color variation, the impact of colorism on children and adolescent peer relations, mass media effects on the promotion of colorism amongst Muslims, and the impact of religiosity and religious practices on colorism among Muslims. We need to take a look at the anti-racism curriculums that are already out. The Examining Whiteness Anti-Racism curriculum of the Unitarian Universalist Association in the United States can serve as a model for what can happen in Muslim communities. This curriculum provides a framework for communities to understand, and I quote from their document, the complex history of white supremacy of over 400 years in the United States and the impact it has had on us as individuals and the society as a whole. National Muslim organizations such as ICNA and ISNA might use this kind of approach to develop a curriculum materials that examine topics such as, first of all, the historical roots of colorism among Muslims, how Islam forbids colorism, the psychosocial impact of colorism on families and individuals, and how colorism stifles Muslim community development, and finally, rooting colorist thinking out of one's own identity. Some of the references as I used are as follows. And I want to thank you for your attention. Well, I want to thank you all.
Hello,
for your
everyone.
attention.
My name is Heidi Fanning, and I'm a recent doctoral graduate of the Comparative International Development Education Program at the University of Minnesota. This project, titled Misrecognition and Refusal, Black Muslim Youth Coalition Building in the American Midwest, draws from a year-long critical ethnographic study of youth citizenship and national belonging in small-town America. Throughout this presentation, I will examine how Muslim youth of the Somali diaspora are misrecognized and pushed out of one community imaginary, yet simultaneously form supportive coalitions with other youth, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, from a nearby town, through non-formal educational activities, notably football. Like many others who have written dissertations, this project stemmed from a personal curiosity. Both of my parents grew up in small towns in the American Midwest. Many of these towns, historically homogeneous, Christian, and working class with strong agrarian roots, had been steadily growing more racially, economically, and religiously diverse, with the increase of immigration and the decline of a powerful union presence. As I thought about the portrayed political and social divisions in media and academic literature, I grew interested in the experiences of youth in such towns. I wondered how youth conceptualize who belongs as an American, and importantly, who decides. This curiosity led to several research questions, 3 of which I address in this paper and presentation. 1, how do youth conceptualize and experience national belonging within educational spaces? 2, are patterns of gendered, racial, religious, or ethnic division reflected in non-formal community spaces affiliated with the school? And 3, if so, do these patterns change over time? I started this work off in a small rural town I called Hampton for a pilot study in the fall of winter of 2017. Hampton is a relatively homogeneous conservative town for much of its history. In the last decade, it has grown to be 25% non-white, with the majority of Somali Muslims, with a smaller Latino population as well. Alongside this shift existed a lot of tension and anti-Black racism, including a national investigated racial harassment and punishment of Somali youth. I attempted to work in this school for my dissertation, and this pilot was meant to facilitate those relationships. But the administration was less responsive, so I conducted a pilot study on the public events such as sports games while I attempted to gain access to the school. Eventually, through an academic colleague, I completed a year-long ethnographic study in Riverton, a town 20 minutes away from Hampton, in the same conference for athletics and academics. Riverton was known as a sundown town where African Americans were violently forced out throughout its history. Over the past couple of decades, however, the racial and political composition of this town has changed dramatically due to an increase in immigration after a blow to the union presence in the town's main industry. At the time of this study, the Riverton school system was 51% non-white, with a significant percentage of immigrants and refugees from Latin America, East Africa, and Asia, who were drawn to Riverton because of the plentiful yet low-paying jobs in the food processing plant. Because of this main industry, they process pork, there hasn't been a comparable Somali Muslim presence, and most newcomers to the town identified as Christian. Importantly, though, in local and regional media coverage, it is depicted and really celebrated as a welcoming community, a place where everyone belongs. This general curiosity brought me to the academic literature on citizenship in education. When most people think of citizenship, they think of the legal status, yet there is an increasing number of citizens who do not belong, whose experiences are lost within this legal framing of citizenship. I consider citizenship as not solely as a fixed legal status or a shared sense of rights and responsibilities to a nation state. Instead, I consider citizenship as an evolving negotiation of belonging within structural conditions and hierarchies. Belonging, like citizenship, has lots of different conceptions, but I thought this idea of feeling at home was resonant for this study. When considering citizenship and belonging as a relational negotiation, it is important to observe and see the everyday interactions, the spaces of encounter and enmeshment where the citizenship and belonging emerges. For many youth, it's unsurprising that the major source of this encounter is the public education system. So I conducted a year-long multi-studied ethnography. Ethnography at its core is a process of hanging out to observe everyday interactions of youth. I chose to complete ethnography because in both of these towns, there was a history of racism and economic strife. And scholars have found people often talk about race and political divisions in ways that are contradictory and elusive. Yet observation of these everyday behaviors can critically highlight these intersectional structures of power that position some individuals to belong and some as outside the imagined community. I also focused on a specific Riverton youth for follow-up interviews, and that's a limitation of this presentation, that I didn't interview some Hampton youth as well. As such, I consider this a longitudinal study, and I conducted analysis over time. Crosstown Themes emerged through multiple rounds of coding and analysis from 2017, where I did the pilot, and 2020 when I wrote up. Interestingly, this idea of political activism was very prevalent throughout 2020. And through my follow-up and co-creating knowledge with my participants, this emerged as a salient theme during that time specifically. I also focused these methodologies generally on the football, because the findings, as it says, football is a hyper-masculine competition, religious like community ritual, and a display of school spirit. But throughout the time I was there, it also emerged as an informal space where a sense of community and societal belonging is negotiated. Football games, both separately at Riverton and Hampton, and especially when they played each other, were spaces where Black students, particularly the Somali Muslim youth from Hampton, were misrecognized as threats, and also where these youth bonded together in acts of refusal and community engagement. They refused to be excluded from a community that seemingly did not want them, and instead carved out their own spaces of belonging within these hierarchies of exclusion based on race and religious identity. For example, in this interview with Joe and Jamal, both Riverton high schoolers, talked about this. But for example, in the majority of Hampton games I observed, there were 3 or 4 or even more rows that separated the Somali high school students that attended from the rest of the majority white student section. These majority male students did not wear the same clothes as the other students along with the theme. They also did not stand the whole game nor partake in the planned cheers of the majority white student section. They watched the game, stood up to cheer when there was a big play, and laughed and joked between themselves. But I observed very little interaction between the Black and majority white students and the Somali students over a season worth of games. Throughout a particular game, there were several comments I overheard from white parents to avoid this role with the Somali students. And in another game, they were described as weird or threatening, especially to younger family members. This is an example of misrecognition. These youth were misrecognized as a threat. And this goes into a lot of other literature using this term, talking about like Poir's work. We talked about that the safer this misrecognition rendered their communities invisible, save for one dominant image, that of a terrorist. And this found that a person or group of people can suffer real damage if they are interacting with a society that mirrored back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Like other studies, many of these experiences of encountering misrecognition as Muslim or misrecognition based on a racial identity could be seen as common sense, everyday, harmless encounters, but they all involved racist and exclusionary readings of the other. This was mentioned by Joe as that town, meaning Hampton, is effed up. And he saw that, he talked about how all the Somali students came over here. They came to the Riverton student section to cheer for their players, the Riverton players, especially in football and basketball. He had mentioned that sometimes they cheer even louder than us, and you know that's hard to do. And Jamal specifically mentioned how the Hampton students have told them that they felt weird over there because they are looked at funny, especially after some of the recent crime in the metro area, and that they liked the Riverton side better because there were more Black students. I actually observed one of the high school games. It's actually a Hampton versus Riverton football game where the Somali youth from Hampton went over to the student section and started cheering for the Riverton team, wearing their leather jackets, wearing their apparel from Hampton. And this happened. This is a repeated theme. This happened again when the two teams played each other in basketball as well. And this is really unheard of between rivals in the same conference, in particular in these really competitive sports like American football and basketball. I quoted this as an example of refusal because the Somali students from Hampton exercised a politics of refusal. They went over to the other side to build community with people that celebrated people who looked like them, even if they weren't Muslim. Davis's work, although focused on Indigenous individuals, thought that a politics of refusal then may occur anytime an individual or group refuses recognition as dictated by a colonial gaze at the expense of their own definition of themselves. So this act of literally leaving their own side when they were being excluded to cheer for their rival was this example of refusal. This reactions of these Black Muslim youth rejected their imposed imaginary, and thus reshaped the very notion of what it meant to belong in Hampton, and thus in the United States as well. Over time, in my fieldwork and since, through the analysis of my project, I was struck by how much the youth from both towns came together to protest for social and racial justice. This was particularly salient in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Amani, who was a Riverton East African, although Christian student, stated, "Generational movement starts with us, stay positive and work for change. Change is on its way." When he was talking about this racial justice march that they planned with the youth from both towns. A lot of the protests in the area around this time were very inclusive and led by these Black youth, stemming from their connections formed and seen in football games. So the theoretical contributions of this piece are many. One, it contributes a rural American perspective to citizenship and education literature. Two, it demonstrates how these intersections of exclusionary hierarchies, particularly surrounding race and religion, emerge through these everyday interactions. But then, importantly, through these protests, it shows how youth both perpetuate, but yet combat exclusionary systems when they build these coalitions together. Going forward, a key area of study should continue to focus on these processes of misrecognitions and then these processes of being refusal, including a deliberate focus on the youth's experiences and narratives. Again, thank you very much. My name is Heidi Fanning, and I look forward to your engagement with this work.
Hello, everyone. My name is Walid Hadidar, and I'm very pleased today to be presenting my paper on Islam, laicité, and the counter-radicalization agenda within France's public education system. So to start with a little bit of context, I want to talk about the concept of laïcité, and some of you might be familiar with it. For those who are not, laïcité is the French version of secularism that denotes a separation between religion and the state in all facets of public life and the public space. So laïcité actually has a close tie to the public education system in France, and schools were the first spaces to be secularized in France before even the Republic got secularized. So in 1881, Jules Ferry, who was the Minister of Education then, passed a bunch of laws that secularized French public schools, separating Catholicism and its influence from France's education system. It was only in 1905 that the French Republic became officially secular. And in the early phases of laïcité in France, secularism was merely like a separationist tool that tried to build a barrier between the influence of Catholicism and overall society until evolving to become a neutrality concept that really keeps the state neutral from all religious influence. It was only after movements of decolonization and the post-colonial stage, with the increase in the number of Muslims migrating to France, that laïcité evolved to be an exclusionary tool that targeted Islam instead of only Catholicism. And this stage is marked by two main events. The first one is the Headscarf Affair, where a principal in Cré sent back two girls back home from school just because they were wearing a veil. And this led to a huge debate within French society around the place of Islam and religious symbols in the Republic. And it led to the 2004 law on conspicuous religious symbols, whereby France banned all display of conspicuous religious symbols in schools, including the veil, the kippah, and the cross. And this is really what marked the exclusionary state of laïcité, moving away from being merely a separationist tool to one that is excluding the religious symbols from the public space. In 2015, laïcité also evolved to have a radicalization, or to focus on the radicalization debate in France. Right after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015, a lot of French ministries passed on the big mobilization for the values of the Republic, which was a movement that basically tried to reinforce laïcité, or argued that reinforcing laïcité within schools would help combat radicalization within French society. And again, this was another interesting turn into the place of laïcité within society in France and its function. And obviously, with the recent anti-separatism laws and the Islamo-leftism discourse happening right now in France, laïcité is continuing to evolve, and its role and function in society is continuous to change. The paper doesn't really dive into these recent events, but it focuses a lot on radicalization. So what motivated the study was primarily looking at the national plan to prevent radicalization in France that was passed in 2018. And a very interesting observation is that one of the first pillars of this plan is around shielding minds from radicalization. And one of the first action plans of this plan is working in schools to defend the values of the Republican school system. So the very first action plan that this interministerial committee passed in 2018 to prevent radicalization was to reinforce laicity in schools. And this is speaking to how the French context of radicalization is very unique to other countries, whereby secularism, laicité, and education play an important role in how France sees the threat of radicalization to be and how it sees itself combating it. And this led to my research question, which is, what is the impact of France's reinforcement of laicity within schools on potentialities for radicalization. So is the French government or the French state right? So is in reinforcing laicity within schools really leading to shielding minds from radicalization? Or does it do the opposite, or is it neutral? And this is what I was curious about as I was embarking on this research project. But first of all, it is important to examine radicalization. And what you see in front of you is the official definition of radicalization that the French state adopts, which, as you can see from my highlighted words, it really focuses on the individual and the group and blames those people for initiating radicalization and decenters the state and its violence from the radicalization debate, not even considering kind of the ecosystem where the state is implicated and that might lead to radicalization or terrorism, which is an interesting finding. So it was important for me in the study to try to look at radicalization from a lens that recenters the state back in, and that also looks at the state, not just at individuals and groups when analyzing this phenomenal concept. It was also interesting to look at literature and understand whether radicalization is always inherently violent. And this is what usually gets promoted within the French state. And any state's response to radicalization is that there's some sort of imaginary that radicalization is always violent. But looking at transformative learning theory that I use in this paper, I argue that radicalization, in a sense, is not always violent. And it's not always negative, right? It's just kind of a response to a three-phase process that transformative learning theory really argues, is that someone is, or a group of people are responding to a trigger through a process that initiates some sort of an outcome. And that response, that outcome is usually a radical outcome, and it can be violent or non-violent. And lastly, going back to my research question, because radicalization was something hard to measure, I had to use a proxy measure that was easily observed. And this is where I rely on the literature in order to use socio-political disaffection as a proxy for trying to understand and look at radicalization. And a lot of literature exists on the link between socio-political disaffection and radicalization. And I define it using Benzing and Kondani's, defining social disaffection as the absence of generalized social trust, and political disaffection as the absence of spaces to politicize one's ideas. And once these two factors are present, these two factors can really have a large influence on radicalization. It can lead to radicalization. And again, both violent and non-violent outcomes of radicalization. So the methodology I used in this study, this is an exploratory study. We're using in-depth semi-structured interviews in French, around an hour and a half, with Muslim identifying youth. And I conducted this fieldwork in Paris, France, between January and April 2018 using snowball sampling. And you can see more details around the methodology in this slide. The interview questions, as you can see from the slides, revolved around the experiences of Muslim youth with laicity in the public space, in the public educational space, and also their experiences with social and political disaffection, getting at whether they feel socially or politically integrated or not. And some of the selected results, the first one is looking at the school. There's a lot of literature that exists on laicity in Islam and kind of the general public space that hints at how laicity tends to stigmatize Muslim youth, how it excludes facets of their identity from the overall public space in France. But there's not a lot of literature on the experiences of Muslim youth with laicity within schools. And the main finding of the study is that the school is a more restricted version of the public space, where while Muslim youth are able to escape some of these facets of laicity in the public space, it's very hard for them to escape the oppression and the stigma that laicity poses and the limitations of their ability to express their religious identities within the school space. Laicite also can lead to the desocialization of Muslim youth in that it cracks down on what it calls communitarianism. So it really discourages Muslim people from building bridges and community with each other, seeing that as some sort of like a sign of inability to integrate within French society. The school is also seems to be an incubator of laïcités into stigma because Islam is not talked about much. It's not encouraged for students to bring it up or kind of be proud and identify with their own religion. Whatever is taught in terms of the histories of religion from a very quote unquote neutral space in France doesn't allow people to explore their religion or to talk about Islam in a way that is congruent to their realities, which leads to increased potential for stigma and also re-Islamization of Muslim youth in France. And lastly, there's a transition within schools from laïcité to laïcisation. So there's a complete shift in how laïcité is in the public space into education space. Schools tend to be spaces where laïcité is used to secularize or laicicize Muslim youth, and that process can be very violent. As can be seen from this testimonial of one of my informants who spoke about how she was just entering first grade in school and she used to wear the veil as a 6-year-old child, kind of mimicking her mother, trying to connect with her roots and her religion. And the minute she showed up to school the first day, the teacher asked her if she was sick, asked her why she was wearing the veil, and did not allow her to wear the veil. And after that day, she hated school. So you can see kind of the deep impact, emotional impact and trauma that laïcité policies and their restrictiveness and exclusionary stance cause to Muslim youth in France. And lastly, the impact on socio-political disaffection. We found that laïcité causes varying degrees of social disaffection as people reported different levels of social integration depending on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. So Muslim youth who are from a lower socioeconomic background, who are women, who are identified as Black, felt much less socially integrated than those who were from, for example, higher socioeconomic status, kind of showing how the intersectionality of these identities really impacts Muslim youth experiences with laïcité within schools. A lot of the emotions used during the interviews were around controlling, excluding, isolated. And this is how a lot of the informants felt the laïcité policies are imposing upon them. And one of the most popular verbs that was used also to talk about the impact of laïcité on social integration is subir, which has a connotation of helplessness. And a lot of the informants felt helpless against these policies, unable to critique them, unable to bypass some within the educational space. And finally, political disaffection was a bit different because we found in the study consistent sense of no or misrepresentation politically. So all of the informants said that they didn't find any spaces for political representation and that they resorted to social media, close friendships, or activist organizations in order to localize and politicize their ideas. The implications of these findings is that the reinforcement of laïcité in schools can be conducive to the socio-political disaffection of Muslim youth, and it might not shield minds from radicalization, as we saw with regards to the impact on stigma and also on social and political disaffection. And this reinforcement can lead to the adoption of ideas and beliefs that are radical, but there needs to be further study in order to understand how or whether these beliefs and actions would lead to violence. And also there needs to be more evaluative research need to be done exploring the link between education, laïcité, belonging, and radicalization in France. Especially that from the exploratory study, we see that laïcité in schools does have a lot of negative effects on the social and political disaffection of Muslim youth in France. I'm sharing my contact information here, but thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to receiving questions and discussing this further. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us on our presentation entitled Fostering Muslim Identity in Full-Time Islamic Schools Alumni Perspectives. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Shahza Khan. I'm the Executive Director of the Islamic Schools League of America. And this is my colleague.
I'm Dr. Seema Imam, Professor of Education at National Louis University.
In this presentation, we'll be going over the research question, literature review, methodology, findings, and implications of a study that we engaged in with alumni from Islamic schools, full-time Islamic schools. As a way of providing some background, we'd like you to know that there are approximately 300 U.S. full-time Islamic schools serving approximately 50,000 Muslim students around the nation in grades K through 12. The Islamic schools were created starting from the 1930s and again another wave in the 70s, many of which had the mission and purpose of helping to foster a Muslim identity in students, to help students become grounded in Islamic values, belief system, and worldview through both curricular and extracurricular activities. For our research question, we examined how did your Islamic school experience impact your identity as a Muslim? And we asked this to alumni of full-time Islamic schools. Just to provide some background on the literature on identity, we know that identity formation is a key element of adolescence. There are multiple identities that individuals construct throughout time and space that are historically situated. They're fluid, they shift from time, from place, and that it's not something that's achieved, but rather it's something that's constructed and reconstructed in different places and spaces. School is a very important place and context in which identity development occurs. For the research that we engaged in, we conducted a qualitative study with semi-structured focus groups that were conducted over Zoom. We used phenomenology to interpret the data in order to center participants' lived experiences. There was a dialogic relationship between the transcripts as well as what was constructed by the main researcher, Dr. Seema Imam, participant portraits that she constructed of each of the 37 participants, including demographics, personal information, and important words, phrases, and stories and quotes from the transcripts, notating the page numbers in which those quotes came up to be able to create an audit trail and increase the validity and reliability of the study. Through this process, we also use snowball sampling, purposeful snowball sampling in order to obtain our participant group. We sought out students, past students who had graduated from full-time Islamic school in the past 10 years, who were Muslim and over 18. We had 14 males and 23 females of diverse backgrounds, ethnically, racially, as well as where they were located and where they went to Islamic school, many of whom were now in college and professionals as well. The findings that we're going to highlight in this next section result in 6 major themes, and we will be highlighting quotes from the participants in this next section to continue to center the voices and experiences of our participants in Islamic schools.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shahza, for getting us started. What's really important is that our research was quite enlightening. We went from focus group to focus group, listening and understanding. And we came away with 2 categories, themes that positively impacted the Muslim identity of our alumni and also themes that negatively impacted. So first I want to take a quick look. I'm going to go through each one of those, but first I want to take a quick look at what happened in forming the identity. So we have 2 quotes from students, and they said things like, didn't really have an identity as a Muslim before I went into Islamic school. I wasn't entirely sure that I was Muslim. When I went into Islamic school, I was like, okay, so now I can finally educate myself and finally understand what this religion is about. More like it formed my identity. The next one, a student said, realizing that being a Muslim is something like you do 24/7. It's something that it's not something that I switch on and off. It's something that's always there. So within this, we start with the theme of community and environment. And in Islamic school, the first participant said the Islamic school did an amazing job on my Muslim identity. The second one said being in that environment, being around Muslims all the time made me confident and comfortable in my identity as a Muslim in the outside world. The next one made a good point about being really active in the community was what, did that for me. Like being present at an event or being in extracurricular activities, being part of a club built my identity. The next theme was relationships, which is really high on the list of what's important in schools. And so teachers and friends and relationships are built over time. Friends won't let you fall behind. They encourage each other. They do good things together. They don't get caught in the wrong crowd. My closest friends are my Muslim friends. They helped me keep my faith strong in college. So these are the words of our participants. Another alumni participant said, I think my middle school was really rough. High school boosted my confidence. I was able, because I did have that positive experience, I was able to leave Islamic school and go to college and be very solid in who I was. So next is engaging with Islam. When we think about now, we're looking at the three themes within the positive impact. So this alumni said going to Jummah and prayer every week from third grade till high school. The Islamic teachings were so impactful. Just being around those people in my life and learning about the religion, Quran, having good teachers and listening to khutbahs and things like that made it much easier to practice these things later on in life until today. So I think this is the last strong factor. I always saw being Muslim like a major part of my identity. It's your philosophy, it's your morals, it's everything that you do that you're thinking about. I love this point she made, this question. What should I do for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Exactly what we want students to be thinking about when they come out of Islamic school. So next we come to the negative impacts, and there were a few. We ran across some big challenges where alum strongly identify as a practicing Muslim, but things happened, things they went through, they witnessed sometimes for their friends, not always for them, but it was strict, maybe too scripted or rigid. So students reported, and this is their voice, I feel like teachers were so focused on the curriculum, on the rules, on the regulations, they forgot to teach us how to love the religion. So it winds up harming you in the long run. Another said teachers did things. I got put in a different class from my friends, and they, the teachers, said because they did not want me in a class with this boy. You like each other. But I said, I don't like this person. And why is this affecting my studies? And it's not my fault. Joining school late, was an interesting perspective that many students shared with us. It's hard to get into the niche, to get into the cliques. Joining school late sometimes meant being ostracized. Joining a very, very tight-knit community where even some are calling their teachers auntie. But I noticed as people came in later, Amira said that in high school and middle school, it was very, very difficult for them to find their niche and be accepted. I think that's a problem and a really important point here in her own words, that as Muslims, we're supposed to be kind, inviting, and welcoming to new people. Getting away from Islam is the third and final theme within our negative impacts. So this student, Khalid, said, getting away from Islam, when I graduated from Islamic school, I actually had wanted never to have anything to do, with any of the Muslims or Arabs in the community. And so he went to college the first semester. He really didn't associate. But later he found Muslims, and because he felt a little different at that time, he got in touch with some good people. Otherwise, when I left Islamic school, it felt like, I wanted to be as far away as possible. So even for this student, the friends that I made from Islamic school, I don't think any of them are practicing. After they graduated and left that environment, like with all its faults and with like its benefits, it kind of left them not knowing what to do, not having any support. Overall, I think some of the students really were telling us that if we do everything in a routine without thinking, that we need to learn how to think. So I think that's coming up in our implications. I think Dr. Shaza will take us through fostering community.
So based on the findings of this research, both the positive factors and the negative factors impacting the Muslim identity of our students, we identify 4 implications that we'd like to share with particularly educators and leaders of full-time Islamic schools. And the first one being that it's absolutely critical to foster community. In doing so, one must have extracurricular activities that engages and creates purpose for every member of their school community. Respectful relationships are absolutely a must. Things even including group prayer, khutbahs, halaqas, jum'ah, these all help foster identity and community for the students. Also being incredibly purposeful and finding ways to be intentional about welcoming new students, having systems in place, having mentors and buddies, and being intentionally inclusive and equitable with various racial, linguistic, male, female, and ethnic groups is something that we build upon in our previous research on sense of belonging amongst alumni.
So the next one was positive learning environment, and fostering a positive learning environment is part of the principles of Islamic pedagogy. And that is available as a PDF if anyone's interested. But here's a quote from Fostering Positive Learning Environment. Caring is an expression of love, and it's central to faith. A classroom environment where students are courteous to one another, concerned about the teacher's opinion of them, and comfortable. This can only be achieved through teacher modeling and classroom strategies based on adab. We want our school and our classrooms to be filled with cooperation, respect, and mutual support. So something for all of us to work hard on.
And of course, this positive classroom environment must also be part of the Islamic school, Islamic studies classroom. And because Islam and the way that it was taught was brought up so many times in fostering Muslim identity, this is another major implication that when we're teaching Islam in our full-time Islamic schools, it really should be inquiry-driven, driven from the curiosities that our students have, that different interpretations should not be shunned, but rather we should bring light to them in a developmentally appropriate way. We should go deeper into topics, especially progressively throughout the years, and that culturally relevant pedagogy and topics, issues that our students are concerned with and engaging with every day, they shouldn't be ignored. Rather, they should be brought to the forefront. And we should teach Islam through the things that our students care about, are thinking about, are interacting with on a daily basis. Finally, Dr. Seema Imam.
Yes, the last category of implication is preparing students for the real world. Students throughout our research reported that we always heard that you're going to be challenged by this when you reach college. And students felt like, regarding gender relations, sex education, college life, alcohol, and other addictive or mind-altering substances, that they weren't quite prepared for what does that challenge look like? What will I need to do? How will I act? So if the implication could be, said, we need to prepare them not to be afraid of the challenge, but to be prepared for taking it on and surviving, finding ways to not engage in certain activities that are challenging and tempting. And there are
And if
new-
I could, just to, Dr. Simamam, just to add on to that last theme about moving away from Islam, this is where it really came through that students felt like, yeah, we
Yes.
could hold on to it while we were in the schools, but once we left, now what are we going to do? So when we intentionally
Yes.
prepare our students for that real world, that's where they're able to retain that Muslim identity, not just from within the school context, but beyond, and that's connecting it back to that fluidity of identity formation as well.
And one thing that's really important is when students ask questions, we need to answer them, because when they're in third grade, if we don't answer their questions, they'll stop asking.
There's so much more to be said, and we invite and look forward to the question and answer portion of this presentation. We also invite you to contact us, and here's our contact information. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
I want to take this opportunity to kind of retroactively introduce our panelists for the benefit of those of you that may have come in late. This was the second session of the symposium, Race and Minority Issues. I'm Dr. Hakeem Rashid from Howard University. My presentation was on colorism in the Muslim world, implications for anti-bias, anti-racist education in the Muslim Ummah. Our second presenter, Dr. Heidi Fanning, her presentation was on misrecognition and refusal, Black Muslim Youth Coalition Building in the American Midwest. Our third presentation, Walid Hedidar of the University of Pennsylvania, Islam, Laicite, and the Counter-Radicalization Agenda within France's public education system. And finally, our last presentation, Fostering Muslim Identity in Full-Time Islamic Schools, Alumni's Perspective, and that was presented by Dr. Shaza Khan and Dr. Seema Imam of the Islamic School Leagues of America. And I think now we're ready to move into the Q&A session. Dr. Kubo, is that right?
Yes, thank you so much, Hakeem. I appreciate you chairing this session and reminding all of us of all the presentations that went before. And it's nice to be able to see people in your little Zoom boxes here to go into our question and answer. So thank you so much for the great presentations. Daria, who is our graduate assistant and symposium assistant, will also be assisting me with our Q&A. There's quite a few questions that have come up in chat. Okay, and we will begin with Hakeem. There is a question that says, does culture play a role in nurturing racist attitudes within Muslim communities?
Oh, I think it does. I think it's actually filtered through culture. So what we see in the way of color consciousness and colorism is an expression of a cultural value of white supremacy that has permeated a lot of different cultural contexts in the Muslim world. And how we see them play themselves out will depend on the cultural context that you're in. I had a chance to spend time in Saudi Arabia. I saw it there. I had a chance to spend time in Sudan. I saw it there. Spent a little bit of time in Pakistan, saw it there. And again, it was filtered through the cultural context that we happen to be in. I think the problem is that the racism, white supremacy, the whole notion of color consciousness has really permeated the entire world. And much of that has to do with the colonization process that took place over the last 500 years, where Europeans have virtually colonized. I mean, there was a saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, for example. And what the British took with them in that British Empire was that whole notion of white supremacy. And cultures internalized that to one degree or another. And we've always seen resistance to that. But it's been such a dominant value in so many cultures, and we can go around the world and we see dark-skinned people discriminated against by their own tribe members based on the color of their skin. And again, it's being manifested through the cultural context that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add to that, in fact, that growing up as a white American and as a Christian, we have to focus not only on white privilege and supremacy, but we also have to focus on Christian privilege. You know, what happens to all the children in America when they're participating in all kinds of cultures other than their own, and their own becomes null because no one recognizes, or too often their own, you know, backgrounds and holidays and foods are ignored. So I think it's really important.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, particularly within the white American Christian context, and even the Black American or other American Christian context, to keep in mind that Jesus was turned into a Caucasian. You know,
Yes.
the picture of Jesus that we see on the walls of so many churches is a white man. You know, I believe the model was Michelangelo's cousin or somebody like that. So those of us, you know, and I reverted to Islam when I was 25 years old, but I was raised Catholic, and all of the religious imagery was Caucasian. I mean, if I closed my eyes and thought about God, it was a white man in a long flowing robe with a long white beard. You know, that was God, and Jesus was his son.
And I recently looked into some of those images a little bit further, and found that in the, you know, the Black churches early in America, the picture of Jesus Christ had a number of children around his knees. I remember this growing up as a Christian. I never saw the one who has the Black child naked, like begging.
Yeah,
But all the other children, yeah, I mean, it was just like, if you look this up, you'll find it, you'll be astounded that this depiction was like part of the, like, National Geographic, and how we, you know, have the images of Muslim, you know, it's very detailed. We can't go into it now, but so impactful.
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you so much for bringing this up too, because in my context in the American Midwest, a lot of this is very politicized as well. Both like the Christianity and the anti-Blackness, it's intertwined in political rhetoric in local media. And that's, again, talking about this like misrecognition of a whole entire diverse group in religion and cultural groups inside as just threats, you know? And so one of the questions in the chat for me was, how widespread is this misrecognition? Well, it's insanely prevalent, because it's just the dominant narrative in this area, as upheld by the media coverage of this diverse group of youth and other people.
Heidi, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on that comment, though. I feel like misrecognition is a little bit soft. I mean, isn't this purposeful? This is the imagery that Dr. Seema's talking about, Dr. Hakeem, Dr. Rashid, bringing it back to the colonialism. I mean, this is about power, and misrecognition feels like, whoops, I misrecognized you.
Yeah,
that's on purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the power of misrecognition that I find, though, to push back just a little bit, is this everyday nature of it in schools, in non-formal activities. Like, people wouldn't necessarily think on one level that like a couple rows distance between a group of students at a football game means that much. Maybe some majority white people might be like, oh, well, maybe they're just sitting with their friends, right? But then this does show these deep long-standing questions of power that you bring up. So yes, I agree, it's a soft term, but not sufficient to talk about the actual violence in that anti-racism or anti-Black racism particularly. But in that context, it was the most salient term that I could do without that just everyday insidious aspect of it.
There's been some important discussion here around the notion of religion and the role that might play in issues of power, misrecognition, and schooling. And there was a question that was directed to Hakeem, but I believe that others may want to weigh in on it as well. But certainly, Hakeem, should religious teachings be employed or not be employed to deal with racism? So the question is, should religious teachings be used or not used to deal with racism?
Oh, I think they should be used, but they should be used in an accurate, particularly historically and culturally accurate kind of way. We can certainly quote the various scriptures, whether they be Jewish, Christian, or Muslim scriptures that counteract this whole notion of white supremacy. The problem is when you have people using religion to justify the racism and the white supremacy. And I think that that's what we've seen happen, again, with this phenomena of colonialism and the imposition of these white European standards of beauty on the rest of the world. And that kind of emanates from this whole notion that, in a sense, the white man is God. You know, God, the European white man made God in his image. You know, and we talk about the Bible says that God made man in his image, but no, the European made God in his image. So when we see portrayals of the divine, we see a European representation. We see a white man in a white robe, and his son is sitting on his right-hand side, who's another European. So this is the kind of imagery that people of color, you know, have to consciously remove from their heads. You know, we can still go into, here in the United States, we can still go into African-American churches and see pictures of a white Jesus on the wall. Well, who is that man? You know, what does he represent? So we have to use religion to counteract, you know, these negative teachings, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. These are questions that have been directed to Heidi. Heidi, to what extent has the coalition project been successful in and beyond the region? If successful, may it be adopted elsewhere in the USA? And is misrecognition practiced because of blatant ignorance or in support of secular media? So this is from Muhammad Haran at about 1:53 p.m. So the first one there, to what extent has the project been successful in the region? Can it be adopted elsewhere with success in the US? And is misrecognition practiced because of ignorance and supported by media?
Yeah, thank you very much for both of those questions as well. I think I'm going to take the second question first, the misrecognition supported by ignorance, or is a result of ignorance. And this kind of speaks to the point that was just raised to me as well, is I don't think so. You know, on one level, I think it's purposeful. I think it's purposeful. It's a question of power and how to keeping people's power. And it's bolstered by like a wide range of different avenues. You know, it's bolstered by, like, you know, what curriculum is taught and what holidays are celebrated. So little things like that. But it's also bolstered and fostered by the kind of these everyday interactions between youth and community members and what have you. On one level, like, I think the hopeful and probably naive part of me wishes it were, you know, based on ignorance, you know, because that's easier taught and easier changed. But at the same time, I think it is this deep question of power and people maintaining power. That also goes kind of into my second question, or the other question as well, is this coalition building successful? Well, on one level, I think defining success is always tricky when you're talking about coalition building and coalition activist work and what have you, because success for who, you know, and success for what type of goal, long-standing, etc. I think in one level, this coalition between these two towns was incredibly successful and long-standing. And both to get recognition about what is actually happening in their schools, particularly anti-Black racism and other types of racism as well. And also just this general understanding, like, how can we deal with this? How can we address this in both of our school, in getting other students in this administration on board. I think having those conversations, bringing people together was a really important part of this study that I found, and both for the youth and for the communities themselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Heidi. I would like to get a question from Vincent that's posed to Walid, who presented to us on Islam, laïcité, and the counter-radicalization agenda within France's public education system. A couple of questions here, Walid. The first one is, do you think that the decline of Christianity over the centuries and the rise of Islam in the last decades has led to radicalization of this concept beyond its supposed neutrality?
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I learned so much from the presentations that I was listening to. With regards to that question, I don't think it's the decline of Christianity per se that really motivated laïcité to become what it has become. I think it's mostly the rise and the politicization of secularism. And it's basically come as a tool that was really easy for the government to use and to politicize around in order to exclude Muslims and Islam from society. And so I think it's really a political evolution in how laïcité was conceptualized more than it is the consequence of the decline of Christianity and the rise of Islam. I think the rise of the number of Muslims in France during colonization and also after colonization, because of many reasons, has definitely brought up, debates within society and I guess uncomfort within the white French people who are not Muslim, against Islam and everything. And I think that has definitely had political effects that led to the use of laïcité and secularism in order to become an exclusionary tool against Islam and Muslims.
Thank you. And then perhaps a related question, could one say that Islam became targeted as an attempt to balance or control French religious landscape?
Yeah, so I think the debate on secularism in France has long kind of stepped away from religion and the traditional secularism framework that we talk about here in the US and other countries of the influence of the church on schooling. Now the debates on laïcité have gone as far as banning people from naming their kids as Muhammad or any other Muslim name, and also banning the display of flags that are not the flag of France. So laïcité in France has gone as far to exclude anything that the French government categorizes as non-French or affiliated with a particular religion, being that a flag, a symbol, a name, even a language. And so I think France is an interesting case if we're trying to look at how does the intersection of politics and violent secularism policies intersect and are used as a tool to spread Islamophobia and to also kind of work towards the construction of a national identity where Islam and Muslims are forcefully excluded. It's a bit of an extreme case, but one that I think is interesting because we are, at least from the US perspective, we're seeing the impacts of that, and also in Canada and Quebec, where there's also a move towards similar laïcité or secularism policies. So things are propagating also beyond France itself.
That's a really good segue into a question posed by Mohammed in relation to Muslim households and the contributions of family to Muslim identity. So the question is, to what extent have Muslim households contributed towards the reinforcement of a Muslim identity in Muslim schools? Maybe we could just say in school, in laïcité.
Yeah, I think Muslim families definitely play a big role, and at least in the context of France, they are the only space where French Muslim students or youth are able to understand what Islam is and practice it, because as long as they step out of their house in the public space, they're pretty limited, and also in schools they're very much more limited, so they can't talk about religion, they can't express their religious affiliation. So there's a crackdown on religious talk in the public space, and especially in school. So the family becomes the only space, and also I think that also affects the potentialities for what we call re-Islamicization, because the lack of spaces to talk about Islam and understand Islam identity creates a void, in a sense, in that particular identity that leaves it susceptible to being, targeted to other, extreme forms or other radical thoughts, etc. So that does have definitely negative effects. But the role of a family is strong. But also sometimes that's positive, again, of nurturing that Muslim identity, but sometimes it also is a pipeline for passing down trauma related to how Muslims have been discriminated against in France. And a lot of families are wary of talking about Islam or Muslims, or helping students nourish that identity because they know of the barriers and the racism and Islamophobia attached to it. So they try to detach their kids from that, hoping for socioeconomic mobility and away from discrimination. But obviously that doesn't happen.
Thank you so much, Walid.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a question posed by Marcella to our presenters, Dr. Shahza Khan and Dr. Seema Imam from Islamic Schools League of America, ISLA. And the question is, I know you've been talking about full-time Muslim private schools, but what implications do you think your research might have for public schools that want to foster religious pluralism and support their students' Muslim identities? So is there anything from your research on private schools that might have application for public schools and fostering religious pluralism there?
Do you want to take that, Shahza?
I'll let you go first, Dr. Seema. You do a lot of work with public schools, and I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's very interesting that both Shahza and I have done research in public schools around Muslim students in public schools. So that helps us view what we're doing in the Islamic school. But certainly, students with their names, the pronunciation of names, the level of acceptance, whether it's Islamic school or a public school, we found quite a few African-American kids saying, that they didn't fit into some of the Desi or Arab cliques, for example. When you get to public school, I think there's a lot of outsider feelings that go on because students are not participating wholeheartedly anyway. They get sucked into some of the other religious holidays, but for example, they don't hear books being read. They don't see themselves, in the curriculum. So I think these are important points that fit the public school. We don't want kids changing their names in order to fit in. We want teachers to pronounce names correctly. We want students to feel welcomed, and whether it's public or private, those kind of things do, fit. So how does a child in a public school setting build a relationship with a teacher who perhaps doesn't respect their mother's hijab and might say things, about the dress of the Muslim woman of the family or women of the family, or the example that was given. I had the same thing with my granddaughter who wore hijab in kindergarten, and then she just suddenly stopped, and it was because of comments from people. So we have a lot to do in public school. We really need to make the strange familiar and work hard to build understanding. And we need to be able to look at dominant culture, dominant religious culture, dominant racial culture, and unpack it and tear it down. Those things don't have a place. If everyone has a right to an appropriate free public education, that's the line we use for the special needs students, right? Well, what's the line for social justice and, welcoming students of different race and religion? Those are my quick thoughts.
If I could just add, absolutely. Dr. Seema and I have both, my research focused originally on the adolescent and identity formation of Muslim American high school students in public schools, and how public schools can actually create spaces so that Muslim youth can freely explore their identities and construct a strong, positive Muslim identity forged with all the other intersecting identities that they have. So there's absolutely some of that work that we've done that I hope that you guys can check out. But I think that in terms of the implications that we had with this research, in particular with Muslim students, alumni of Islamic schools, there's a lot of transference that can occur. Intentionality, right? Being intentional about being inclusive, about recognizing people's unique backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, ethnic, racial, having that reflected in the curriculum as well as in your pedagogical practice, the way that you center the things that interest, the concerns, being student driven. What are the things that are concerning our students right now? Let's talk about what Heidi's research happened in she was still analyzing that research in 2020. Our kids are just coming back into the physical presence of being with each other after an incredibly traumatic 18 months in the United States of America and all around the world, but especially here in terms of healthcare, in terms of racial justice, in terms of so much. January 6, 2021, right? Whatever we call that. There is a lot that they're processing. We need to be able to center our curriculum around all of that and allow them to reflect from their places, their spaces, their identity, and to be able to really be able to use something called criticality. Criticality is a core tenet of African-American historical educational societies that Dr. Goldie Muhammad talks about in her talks as well. Dr. Goldie Muhammad's work is also very instructive about how we can use this research on helping students see themselves in the curriculum and really be able to forge strong, positive identities of themselves.
Mm-hmm. There was a question posed, it was early on for Hakeem, but perhaps other people could weigh in. Is there a role for critical race theory in relation to the research that you're doing, or implications for schools, private schools, public schools? Any thoughts you have on critical race theory applied to your work?
Well, I think that critical race theory is certainly a vehicle for understanding the role of race and racism in American society. And I think it can be used to analyze the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. It's not anything that can be used just by itself, though. I think that we have to kind of take a look at multiple, not only theoretical perspectives, but really, look at the history behind what we're dealing with. Critical race theory has become kind of a code word now that most people who are opposing it and challenging it, they have no idea what it is. This whole idea that we don't want critical race theory taught in the schools. Well, it never has been taught in the schools. So it's a smokescreen for not wanting to teach the true history of the United States. So I think that, yes, critical race theory can be used, but again, we don't want to get bogged down in any kind of irrelevant discussion of critical race theory.
I would agree with that. I think that what's happening now is a huge distraction.
Yeah.
In Illinois, they've decided that we need to use the culturally relevant pedagogy as we teach teachers, where I am a professor teaching teachers. And so it's a requirement in the state of Illinois for teachers to be able to do culturally relevant pedagogy, but they're not well equipped. So the schools haven't gone back and learned about that. Right. They're learning about it now. So it's another one of those things where it's implemented before people have learned really about it. And so it gets, maybe like other things, too often we see something implemented and then it gets thrown out with, confusion before training happens. So that's what's worrying me. Then the same thing could happen with what we learned about critical race theory, but there is now something in the higher education that, landscape that works around religious pluralism, and how, religions have been largely ignored except for dominant religions. So Christianity, those holidays are always noted for big periods of time, all of December, you know, so I come back to the religious point because, you know, race has been made hard to understand. It should be obvious. I grew up as a white American. I consider myself a person who, when I wore hijab, walked out on white privilege. And that was profound for me. I grew up in a sundown town. And that is, you know, there's
everybody understands what sundown towns are.
Yes, well,
Be
you know,
defined.
I remember my grandparents saying there's a Black man in town. We have to make call from house to house to make sure the person leaves by 6. We used to say, we didn't say sundown. I didn't know the sundown terminology so much
Right.
later, but you know, Loen's book, he grew up in almost the same place that I grew up in Illinois, has taught me a lot. You know, he's the author also of Lies My Teacher Told Me, you know, and his sundown towns. We still have a town in Illinois called Anna. Ain't no the N word here. No, wait, I forget what the A is for. Allowed. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, these things just blow my mind. How on earth can that still be, you know, allowed to be the name of the town if that's what it meant? A ceremony needs to be held. So,
Thank you so much. I'm
stop
just trying to
there.
be mindful of time, and I just
Sure.
really want to thank our presenters, our chair of the session, and our panelists, paper presenters, and truly for the audience whose questions were very interesting. I wish we could have had time to get to all of them, but certainly people can take that up with our panelists separately, you know, by email, etc. A reminder that tomorrow is our second day of the symposium, and we start at noon. Session 3 it is, and it will focus on discursive practices, psycho-emotional challenges facing Muslim youth. And in the later afternoon, session 4, we'll look at curricular approaches in relation to our theme. So I wish everyone well, and we hope to see many of you tomorrow. Any other things from Ilham or?
Yeah, just a quick reminder asking people to please take 5 minutes to take the survey. And tomorrow we also have a special session on writing for publication, because we hope that many of you will choose to write your presentations into manuscripts submitted to the Journal of Education in Muslim Societies. Of course, not everyone would need a session on writing for publication, but we thought this would be a nice way to give people some ideas on preparing their manuscripts. So we also want to thank you here from our IIIT office headquarters, and we'll see you tomorrow.